Hello and welcome to DW's On the Green Fence podcast. My name is Neil King, and today it's all about frogs. Or the trade with frogs' legs, to be precise.
We do not know about species identities. We do not know about the risk of diseases which may be spread. So there are many issues around this trade, and nothing has happened now more than 40 years.
That's Mark Auliya from the Leibniz Institute for the Analysis of Biodiversity Change here in Bonn. Now, his team published a study in the journal Nature Conservation that highlights how the consumption of frogs' legs in the European Union is contributing to the decline of wild frog populations in supplier countries, notably in Asia. But before we talk to Mark about the global frogs' legs trade, let's just take a short step back. Historic records show that people began eating frogs in southern China from at least the 1st century AD onwards. In Europe, it apparently was some French monks who began eating them in the 12th century during Lent, when it was forbidden to eat meat. Back then, the monks obviously didn't consider the frogs as proper meat and thought they could get away with it. But it is something that has persisted to this day, in France in particular. Frogs' legs are considered a delicacy there and also an integral part of French cuisine. And thanks to the French desire for frogs' legs, the EU is the world's largest importer. And according to Mark Auliya and his team, over 40,000 tons of frogs' legs were imported from 2010 to 2019. That's up to 2 billion frogs killed for their legs. Time to bring in Mark now and find out more about the frogs' legs trade and why it needs to change.
It is somewhat irritating to recognize that millions of tons of frogs' legs are being traded across the globe for consumption purposes, mainly in Western Europe. And the main issue around this is that the source countries who supply these frogs' legs collect them from the wild. So the European Union is a main consumer of wild frogs, and none of the species collected for the frogs' legs trade is regulated across borders. So we do not know about species identities. We do not know about the risk of diseases which may be spread. So there are many issues around this trade, and nothing has happened now more than 40 years.
Okay, so, if we go into the details of it a little bit, you say it's not very well regulated, this frogs' legs trade. Do we know where these frogs are coming from?
Well, the main supplying countries to Western Europe are in Southeast Asia, Indonesia and Vietnam, as well as Eastern European countries, Turkey and Albania.
You said that most of these are caught in the wild, essentially. That sounds to me as if it's rather work-intensive. Why wouldn't countries who are supplying frogs go for factory farming instead?
That has been promoted in the past to rather breed frog species that are high in demand for the frogs' leg trade in Europe, but the issues are manifold in these frog farms. The management in place is not working according to specific guidelines that have been set up for these farms to prevent escapees into the wild, escapees of exotics into the wild, escapees of infected specimens into the wild. And of course, there's no control of any disease within these farms. Also, chemicals are used to treat the species, and some of these chemicals are also not the best choice. So some countries apparently rather prefer to collect from the wild because you don't have these farm issues.
But is it really less risky? Because I'm sort of wondering, with wildlife, we all know about, zoonotic diseases. Is it really such a good idea getting these creatures from the wild and consuming them?
No, it's not at all a good idea to get them from the wild, because there we have the problem of sustainability. And the species now mainly involved in this international trade are all non-CITES listed. meaning that none of the species is regulated within international trade activities.
Just in case you're wondering, CITES stands for the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. It's an international agreement between governments, and its aim is to ensure that international trade in specimens of wild animals and plants does not threaten the survival of the species. Back to Mark now.
There have been some studies in the past, also in Turkey, claiming that species involved in the frog's legs trade have been locally, regionally overexploited. And this is also the case for some species in Asia, where this information is also backed up in the Red List assessments by the World Conservation Union, the IUCN.
I mean, there seems to be a bit of a focus. If I'm looking at, I was looking into your study, and it seems like most of these frogs, they come from Asia. But I mean, of course, frogs also exist in other parts of the globe. What is this focus with Europe, importing frogs from Asia? Why are Asian frogs so sought after?
Well, Asia, in particular Southeast Asia, including now China, is a hotspot region for the utilization of wildlife resources. So now with these frogs, Asia has understood to commercialize trade in them. I mean, you also have like big-legged species in Africa. However, the commercial trade out of Africa for that purpose until now is not actually in place. Rather than consumption occurs within national borders in African countries. So the business orientation in Southeast Asia is very, very high. And so this is probably the main reason why the trade is linked to that part of the world.
If we take a look at the actual species that are being eaten, Mark, I mean, can you perhaps give us just an idea which species is bearing the brunt here right now, and which species are you most worried about that we actually might lose it?
The big-legged species from Indonesia, some of them within the genus Limnonectus, they have been already regionally overexploited. There are quite a few, like Limnonectus blythii, for instance, the Blythe's giant frog, or the Kuhl's brood-headed frog. They are regionally exploited. The trade dynamics are incredibly complex. If there is a high demand in importing countries in the Northern Hemisphere, for instance, with source countries in Southeast Asia like Indonesia, the traders in Indonesia very quickly switch to other populations to keep up the demand, or even will switch over to look-alike species which have not been involved in the trade before.
But I assume we always know when the frog's legs arrive here. We can always tell which species is arriving, or is that also difficult to determine?
That is one of the highlights, actually. I mean, you cannot protect anything in the long term if you do not know what to protect. So you need a transparent information data set on the species involved in the trade, and not only of the species, also where they have been collected, where they have been harvested. Was it a species in, let's say, Sumatra in Indonesia? Was it in Western Java? Or was it in Eastern Turkey or Western Turkey? And what species was it? Because if you have the processed skinned frog's legs, you will not be able to tell what species it is. That's why you need to do DNA testing. And there was a very nice study in 2017. Well, they checked the DNA of frozen frog's legs packed in French shops. And they found out that the species which was labeled outside of the bags was not actually the species packed inside the bag. So this is something which should not happen. But now some people may say, well, frogs, they reproduce so many eggs, they grow quickly, so all life history traits are actually in favor to collect them in those high numbers. But I mean, this trade is ongoing for 4 decades and longer, And now you can see what is actually happening. And it is not only the trade or the offtake for consumption purposes. You always have to see a combination of other threats which impact together on a species or a population.
Right. So effectively, if I understood you correctly there, we don't actually know exactly which species are being eaten in Europe right now and how many of those might be protected.
Well, we more or less know, according to figures provided by Indonesia. They have quotas for a few species, and they have also papers published naming the species which are involved in exports. We also have that from studies published in Turkey. So we have that. But in the end, if you have bags packed labeling a very common species, of course you can't make DNA checks on every frog leg, you know. What I'm always trying to communicate is trade may be able to happen, but the guidelines and the framework around has to be robust and has to be monitored. It has to be able. You have to be able to control it. You have to able to make checks. You have to able to verify that this legal trade is sustainable, and this is always one of the issues. Many people think everything which is legally traded is also sustainable, but this is not the case. If we compare other regulations with other countries, we have, for example, the Leibniz database in the United States, which is basically the law enforcement management information system. In the US, they collect imports and exports of every species coming into the country and leaving the country, also non-CITES species. So why do we not have something like that for the European Union?
Mark, perhaps just on a very technical level, I'm just trying to imagine this now. You know, if frogs are caught, let's say in Indonesia, and they're caught alive, I mean, how are they exported? Are they exported dead? Are they killed and frozen, or are they exported alive, or how does this work?
Yeah, this is also an important issue to take into consideration. The industry already processes these frogs' legs in the source countries, and apparently they are or must be exported frozen. Also because of the climate, they will probably get some disease or they get mold, you know. So you have to keep them cold over a longer period. And however, there may be also a number, which probably now from Turkey and Albania, which may also be exported alive, but we do not know. We just do not have that information.
Okay. But I assume now that the import of live specimens is riskier because it could also then include in bringing in pathogens, right?
Exactly. That's another issue. And we know, the North American bullfrog, which is now distributed in more than 40 countries worldwide, which is a highly invasive species and also carrier of pathogens. If you release those intentionally or unintentionally from farms where they are bred, they will carry in, diseases into native amphibian populations and can infect those. However, they not only carry the fungi, which have been recorded in the 90s, also the Rana viruses. So, these North American bullfrogs do not die off because of these viruses. They just carry them on to other species. And if you process frogs' legs of the North American bullfrog, and probably the cooling chain across the trade routes is interrupted, it may be an issue that they also carry viruses. And again, we don't have the data about this.
Mark, I mean, I'm sort of asking myself, why do we have to import them? I mean, if the French, for instance, are the biggest consumers of frogs' legs in the EU, I mean, couldn't the French just establish their own frog farms, and have them well regulated and also farm a local species that isn't threatened by extinction?
Well, the main...
I mean, why do they have to come from Asia? Why do they have to be, this exotic
Yeah,
specimen?
well, there's so many species which are exotic and which are imported. It's not only frogs' legs, it's across all vertebrates, it's invertebrates. We even don't have numbers of invertebrates being collected just for a variety of purposes. And the frogs' legs trade is basically to support traditions locked into European countries. And this is something to question. Should we really maintain these traditions, or should we just rethink and provide alternatives?
Yeah, of course. But I'm sort of wondering, Mark, is it also, haven't we got the frog populations here to eat? Haven't we got the numbers that would actually, to meet the demand that the French have? Or why is it that they can't eat their own frogs?
Another good question. There are species of frogs consumed in Europe, the genus Pelophylax, green frogs, I would just put them into general, which have a lot of species complexes and not are actually identified well in trade. However, if we would have this amount which is imported from Asia, if we would harvest that amount within European borders, I would assume we would not have a lot of frog populations left.
Have you ever eaten frog's legs yourself?
No, I never had the opportunity. I didn't have also, there wasn't an event where I was asked. Probably I would taste it and just to have that experience and to tell people how it tastes like. But people say it tastes a bit like chicken, as many meat, also snake meat, does, as some people say, but I never tasted it, no.
Okay, but your interest in frogs doesn't extend so far then that you wouldn't try it? Because personally, I've never tried it myself either, but I don't think I would. I don't think I really want to be honest. But I mean, my question basically is your fascination for frogs or your interest in frogs. And when did that start? Is it something? Because I just on a personal level, I think it'd be really interesting to hear from a scientist. The fascination for frogs. Where does that come from?
Well, it's not only frogs. It's actually more reptiles. But as I said, frogs. The study of frogs is also included in the biological discipline of herpetology, and this actually started in early times. I was raised in South Africa, and I had a lot of experiences with wildlife in the backyards, in the neighborhood, and I don't know, just was sensitive to wildlife, and this I could maintain this interest, and especially always the link to conservation, because I like pure science, but not detached from conservation, especially nowadays.
Mark, that brings me to my next question. If we come back to the topic, with what is happening with the international frog trade, I mean, what happens if we lose frog species?
Like with many other species, I mean, ecosystems and their life communities are already distorted, I would say, are not functioning well. You need a balance in the diverse ecosystems around the globe to sustain this balance, and this balance can only be achieved if you sustain the players in that ecosystem which are constituted or represented by species as a whole. So if you take away a species, now let's say a frog species which is not maybe dominant, but very representative of one ecosystem, then you probably will have an up or an increase of insects, some insect species. And having an increase on that insect species can lead to more destruction of leaves, of greenery around the area, of herbs. Those herbs which will be destructed by the higher insect populations probably also had plant eaters which will not be able to eat these plants again. So, you can add on more and more and more. But if you want to redirect that question to the species of frogs traded for their legs, many of those species are also collected in rice plantations, in paddy fields in Southeast Asia. And there are studies, I think, in the Philippines. There is one in Indonesia, I think, also showing that a decrease of a frog population in a paddy field leads to a direct increase of mosquitoes. So, and mosquitoes are carriers of parasites. It's always the same, People want to make the quick money. They do not think about what are the middle-term, long-term effects of severely changing a life community, a trophic cycle, a prey-predator relationship. Because this is the quick money to earn, the quick business. And this is probably also the reason why many people do not want to set up a farm. And those who set up a farm to breed, they do it without the guidelines because the guidelines are not being monitored, or maybe they are not guidelines, and that's the issue.
I mean, that also means then if there are no guidelines for the farming, that the meat itself, it could be problematic. It may not even be clean, right? What kind of chemicals are used, for instance, in frog farming?
Yeah, there are a lot of different chemicals. There have been studies in Vietnam showing, I think in India as well, showing that, you have hormones, you have, I'm not sure about the names now, but you have quite a few chemicals treating them to treat them against infection. But you do not actually have to go into farms. You can go into the wild, and if they are collected in rice plantations, that the legalization of certain pesticides is far wider in those countries than in European countries. It's less stricter. So what I realized while compiling this review, there's actually no study to show or to check if there are any pesticide residues in the frog meat, which Western European countries consume. What I think, why do scientist groups, who are sensitive to these issues, have to raise funds and find where the money comes from to conduct such studies? Isn't this something actually to put in place by the trade section itself? If I want to trade and export and fetch high revenues from that wildlife resource, I should establish all guidelines and all management to make sure it's sustainable, it's legal, and it's transparent.
It seems clear to me, having from all I've heard and from all you've said, that this is obviously a blind spot. We need to clean up this frog trade. There are a lot of things happening there which aren't right. But what are your recommendations if you were to highlight some of the main recommendations for supplier countries, but also for the consumer countries? What should happen next?
First, the consuming countries have a big responsibility. It's not always the source countries. The main thing is we have to have a database from where we can see everything, the species, the trade routes, the harvest areas where they have been collected, and so on and so on. We, as the European consumers, cannot exploit probably a weak enforcement in place in those countries for our purposes. This is a disbalance, and this is not okay.
Many thanks to Mark Auliya from the Leibniz Institute for the Analysis of Biodiversity Change in Bonn for shedding some light on the rather murky frog's legs trade, which, thanks to vast European and especially French demand, is putting frog populations in Asia under a lot of stress. That's it for this week. Please do drop us a line if you have any feedback or questions. Our email address is onthegreenfence@dw.com. Many thanks to my colleague and producer Natalie Muller and my sound engineer Michael Springer here in Bonn, Germany. And a big thanks to all our listeners for sharing and rating this podcast. My name is Neil King. Take it easy and take care.